Hello, and blessings on your day. My name is Nancy Willard. This is a 3-part video series, Engage Students to Embrace Civility. Part 1, What Isn't Working and Why? Please let me introduce myself. My background is I was a special education teacher of children with emotional challenges. I became an attorney and then shifted to education technology consultant. For over the last couple of decades, I've been a researcher and consultant in trauma, bullying, harassment, and digital safety. I'm the author of Cyberbullying and Cyber Threats, which actually was the first book in the world ever published on cyberbullying. I also addressed suicidal threats and threats of violence. I also wrote Cyber Safe Kids and Cyber Savvy Teens and Cyber Savvy, a book for students. My current books are Engage Students to Embrace Civility, Be Positively Powerful, a guide for teens on achieving resilience and empowerment, and Be Positively Powerful, Resilient When Things Get Tough, and the Spanish translation of that latter book. The story of how I came about my theories and approach on bullying prevention and reduction starts with when I wrote the book Cyberbullying and Cyber Threats in 2006. My conclusions in writing that book, and realize I am very research focused, so I was focusing on the research, but what I concluded was that what educators are being told about those who engage in bullying is wrong. And the way that they've been told to address bullying simply isn't going to work in the digital age, okay? Educators are told to create rules, supervise, tell students to report, investigate, and then impose consequences on anyone who's engaged in wrongdoing. How is that going to work in digital space? Schools aren't making rules for the websites or apps. Adults aren't present, school staff aren't present in youth digital safety communities. Even more than in school, students aren't reporting these situations because they're pretty darn sure adults are going to make it worse. Many times, adults, principals, don't know how to effectively investigate digital safety issues, and if they do impose punishment, there's the potential for uncontrollable digital retaliation. So here's the reality check. Adults are not in control. We have to empower young people with the skills and motivation to independently foster positive relations. I thought it might be helpful if I conveyed a lesson that I learned from my father. This is my father. He co-invented the process to make potato flakes along around 1950s when I was born. He always taught me that to make positive change, it's necessary to look at what is not working and figure out why, then to identify based on research what approaches hold greater promise for success. In this presentation, I will be attempting to explain why what schools are doing currently is not working, and then present strategies that hold a better promise of effectiveness. As I'm recording this, summer 2021, I think it's really important that we consider the school year concerns for the year 21-22. There are 3 really critically important concerns. First of all is that students who are normally bullied have not been experiencing bullying in remote learning, and it's highly probable they are going to feel even more hopeless when they return to school because the bullying is going to start happening again. Hurtful behavior, as we'll learn in this video, is very frequently to establish a student's position on the social ladder in a new school population. That is when they're entering middle school or high school, which is why we have a greater level of hurtful behavior in the early grades of either middle or high school. That didn't occur this year. So this year, say it starts at 6, we're going to have 6th and 7th graders jostling around to establish their social status, as well as 9th and 10th graders. And lastly, and probably most significantly, the social and political unrest over anti-racism, transgender students, and everything else we're fighting over appears to be heightening the prospect for unrest in our schools. When we consider this further, realize that bullying is associated with suicide behavior, and suicide behavior increases when kids come back to school. Students who are not bullied during remote learning, who are now again being bullied, I believe will be at very high risk. I also think those students who are gender diverse will be at very high risk. In addition, bullying is associated with school violence. Those who are bullied frequently carry weapons. Most school shooters had experienced pretty significant bullying. We've got an increase in white nationalism violence and threats, and an increase in Black Lives Matter advocacy. All of these factors make me extremely fearful that we're going to see increased suicides and increased school violence next year. I think we're also going to have to pay close attention to trigger words. I've long advised never use the term bully or call a student a bully. This is name calling. I think the same needs to be said of never call students a racist or homophobic. This also is name calling. And in today's climate, it may actually best not to even use the terms racism, anti-racist, or homophobia. We need to shift in some way. All of these appear to being trigger words in today's politically charged climate. Talking about racism appears to imply that we are accusing white people of being racist. I think it will be really important to shift to positive words, positive relations, respect, inclusion, friends, civility, kindness, achieving equity, embracing diversity, and make sure that we address the concerns about any student who is treated badly. Diversity means appreciating our differences, all of our differences. Inclusion means valuing and including everyone, and equity means treating everyone fairly. These are the messages I believe we need to be really consistently communicating. As I indicated, the title of this video is What Isn't Working and Why? So you should ask me, Nancy, what is the evidence that what schools are currently doing isn't working? This is the evidence. First, we have to focus on the harms of this kind of hurtful behavior. Being bullied and also engaging in bullying can contribute to lifelong physical and mental health problems, significant interference with learning, chronic absences, and the increased risk of violence and suicide. Schools are always told they need to use evidence-based best practices. Well, unfortunately, several recent meta-analyses of bullying prevention programs have demonstrated that there is marginal to no positive impact in reducing bullying. This is at the elementary level. There is zero effectiveness at the secondary level. There simply are no evidence-based best practices as measured by a program that has been implemented and determined to be effective. There is a need to implement research-based approaches that have a likelihood of success with effective evaluation. In 2010, the Obama administration launched a very significant effort to do a better job of addressing bullying. The CDC has been measuring the percentage of students who report being bullied since 2009. If you look at this data, you see there has been no decline in student reports of being bullied. And there's actually been an increase in their perception or in their actions of not going to school because they have concerns about their personal safety. Numerous studies have found that students do not perceive that the actions of school staff are effective in preventing or responding to bullying. In these numerous studies, students overwhelmingly believe that teachers ignore or do not recognize hurtful activities, are not prepared to intervene if asked, and are incapable of doing anything effective in response. This is the evidence from a researcher whose name is Dr. Bradshaw. By the way, all of the citations for all of the research that I'm going to be showing you are in my book, Engage Students to Embrace Civility. What she found in surveying both staff and students is that 87% of staff say they have effective strategies for dealing with bullying. 58% of middle school and 66% of high school students said that school staff are not doing enough. Further, she asked whether staff make things worse when they intervene. Only 7% of staff admitted that they might make things worse, whereas 61% of middle school students and 59% of high school students said staff make things worse when they intervene. Lastly, 97% of staff said that they would intervene if they saw someone engaging in bullying or hurtful behavior. And 43% of middle school students and 54% of high school students said they saw staff when there was a bullying situation who did nothing. Another study by Perkins, and Craig found that the highest reported rates of bullying occurred in the classroom, hallways, and lunchroom. And these are locations where staff are expected to supervise. They also found that the failure of staff to intervene was associated with increased distress of the targeted students. In 2015, I conducted a national online study of more than 1,500 students. The full report of this study is on my website. This symbol, Embrace Civility, will be on the slide indicating data that is from this study. In this study, I asked students if someone had been hurtful to them, and then asked both about frequency and emotional upset. I considered the more vulnerable students the ones who were being treated badly once a week or more or almost daily, and were upset or very upset or found it difficult or impossible to get this to stop. So of these students, they reported that staff was present 65% of the time, and that things only got better when they were treated badly in front of staff 13% of the time. 47% of the time things stayed the same, and 40% of the time things got worse. This is students who are being treated badly in the presence of school staff. As you must know, tell an adult is the primary prevention approach. While students are told to report if somebody's being hurtful to them, they are also often told not to tattle. This creates a social norm that if you tell an adult when somebody's being hurtful to you, you are a snitch, which leads to retaliation. Snitches get stitches. So let's investigate the effectiveness of the tell an adult approach. The National Crime Victimization Study School Crime Supplement found only 43% of students bullied at school told school staff. The Youth Voice Project was a study done by Drs. Davis and Nixon. They asked students who had been bullied and were feeling distressed whether or not they told adults, and then what happened. As you will see, some of them at elementary school told, and things got better. This changes dramatically in middle school and high school. The vast majority of students do not tell an adult. This is understandable based on the developmental considerations as they're in puberty and becoming adults. But most significantly, after they told, only about a third of the time did things get better. A third of the time things stayed the same, and a third of the time things got worse. Now, in my study, I asked similar questions, but I conducted my study in a very different way from Davis and Nixon. Only 36% of the more vulnerable students told a staff member about a recent hurtful incident, and things got better 30% of the time. 45% of the time things stayed the same, and 25% of the time things got worse. Looking at that data in a slightly different chart, 64% did not tell a staff member, 11% told and things got better, 16% told and things stayed the same, and 9% told and things got worse. I also asked students why they didn't tell. They didn't tell because they didn't think the school staff member would do anything to help. They thought the school staff member might make things worse, and these were definitely the two highest. They thought they would be blamed. They thought they probably deserved to be treated badly, and they thought that the student being hurtful would likely have retaliated. So, doing a little calculation in math, it appears that the evidence of the tell an adult approach is that this approach is effective about 10% of the time. What grades would we give students if they got about 10% of the answers correct? So, if educators intend to use this same process of making rules, supervision, telling students to report, investigating, and imposing consequences, I maintain that this is insanity. You're doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. The other issue that is not being addressed effectively is the concern of staff who are hurtful. Dr. McCovey gave this definition of hurtful staff: a pattern of conduct rooted in power differential that threatens, harms, humiliates, induces fear, or causes students substantial emotional distress. He considers this an abuse of power that is chronic and involves degrading a student, often in front of other students. In the exceptionally little research that's been done on this, the concerns of staff who are harmful to students is that these hurtful staff members cause profound harm and destroy trust. They model hurtful behavior to students, and students who are bullied both by staff and peers experience profound distress. I'm going to tell you about one situation that causes me extreme frustration. The National Research Council was producing a report on bullying, and they have two reports. One is from a workshop that they held. Youth were present at this workshop, and all of the presenters were researchers, esteemed researchers in bullying. At the end of the 2-day workshop, the young people were asked about concerns that were not addressed. And their response was, every single one said, teachers and adults as bullies. Teachers can be bullies too. If teachers give the impression that this kind of behavior is okay, the kids are going to think this kind of behavior is okay. We can't have teachers and coaches being okay with bullying kids, in addition to the students who are doing so. Why this makes me so frustrated is that when the resulting National Research Council came out several years later, it totally omitted any reference to this strongly expressed student concern. And this is despite the fact that they had an entire section on school climate and staff-student relations. Further, there is no guidance on staff bullying on the stopbullying.gov website, and no questions are asked about staff bullying on any national student survey, and I haven't seen them on any state student surveys either. Students who are bullied by staff are vulnerable, devalued, and unable to stand up for themselves. They also become targeted by peers and are not defended by other students when peers are hurtful, and there are usually no negative consequences for staff. As Dr. McAvee stated, and deserves to be repeated, students who are bullied by teachers typically experience confusion, anger, fear, self-doubt, and profound concerns about their academic and social competencies. Not knowing why he or she has been targeted or what one must do to end the bullying may be among the most personally distressing aspects of being singled out and treated unfairly. Over time, especially if no one in authority intervenes, the target may come to blame his or herself for the abuse and thus feel a pervasive sense of helplessness and worthlessness. There is research that has identified these kinds of students are more often bullied by staff: those with a minority sexual orientation or identity, those with weight problems, with disabilities, from a minority religion, or from a minority race or national origin. Now, in the survey that I conducted, I asked students 4 questions about hurtful behavior. I asked if someone had treated them badly, been hurtful to them. I asked if they had been hurtful to someone else. I asked if they had witnessed students being hurtful to someone else. And I asked if they had witnessed a school staff member be hurtful to students. I really wasn't intending to study this issue. But then when I got the data and started evaluating it, this jumped out as hugely important. So there were 4 responses, and I classified them into whether they had never witnessed staff be hurtful, or they had ever witnessed staff be hurtful, and ever included witness this once or twice a month, once or twice a week, or almost daily. And then what I did is I compared the reports of those students who had witnessed students being hurtful, whether they had been hurtful or someone had been hurtful to them, based on whether they had never witnessed staff be hurtful or ever witnessed staff be hurtful. So I asked, how frequently in the last month did you witness a school staff member be hurtful to a student? 9% said almost every day. 12% said once or twice a week. 21% said once or twice a month. And 28% said never. Then the results on these other 3 questions about student hurtful behavior was analyzed based on their response to whether or not they had witnessed a staff member behave badly, treat a student badly. The students who had witnessed school staff be hurtful to a student reported significantly higher levels of student-on-student hurtful behavior. This is at the 0.001 very significant level. So see for yourself on the question, how frequently did you witness students being hurtful? If they had ever witnessed staff be hurtful, look at the blue. That's that they had never seen students being hurtful. Or if they had never witnessed staff be hurtful. How frequently were you hurtful? If they had ever witnessed staff being hurtful, or if they had never witnessed staff being hurtful. How frequently was somebody hurtful to you? If they had ever witnessed staff being hurtful or had never witnessed staff being hurtful. So my conclusions from this are that we can achieve a significant reduction in students being hurtful to each other if greater attention is paid to stopping school staff from being hurtful to students. And I'm getting into solutions at this point in time, but I believe that it is essential to enunciate clear standards regarding expectations on how school staff are going to treat students. We need to increase staff skills in effective behavior management, especially trauma-informed practices. We need to address the cultural biases of staff and ensure appropriate reporting and a restorative intervention in any situation where a staff member has been hurtful. I mentioned at the beginning that my perception when I wrote my cyberbullying book was that what educators have been told about bullying behavior is at the very least partially inaccurate, and the approaches that they've been directed to use are ineffective and many times in conflict. It is my belief that educators and schools will do lots better if they have accurate insight and better guidance. Bullying prevention is not rocket science. It is far more complicated. Those rockets, they generally do as they are told. So let's investigate at this point in time why these challenges might be present. So first of all, let's recognize and acknowledge that schools have zero or close to zero control over a number of things. Societal influences, including what political leaders, media, and social media are doing. Family values, which are the values imparted by parents and other important adults to the students prior to their entering the school building. And other challenges related to schools, underfunding, increased student distress, lack of counselors, a myopic focus on test scores. In evaluating the challenges and in coming up with responses, I focus on two different aspects. One is prevention, the reduction of hurtful behavior, and the other is intervention, responding in those situations where someone has been hurtful. So under prevention, we have to discuss the concerns about what is bullying, information about hurtful behavior that's partially inaccurate, and the focus on adult control. Under intervention, we have ineffective and conflicting directives on how to intervene, state statutes that are not consistent with the requirements in federal civil rights regulations, and federal civil rights regulations have been undermined. These are the challenges related to prevention. On the stopbullying.gov website, there's this section on staff training on bullying prevention. To ensure that bullying prevention efforts are successful, all staff need to be trained on what bullying is, what the school's policies and rules are, and how to enforce the rules. This is adult control thinking. Just say no didn't work. Why do we think no bullying zone is going to work? So first it's suggested that staff know what bullying is. So what is bullying? Well, that's awfully confusing. We've got statutory definitions, which means we've got 50 different definitions, but they all kind of indicate that it's an intentional, hurtful act that's causing substantial disruption and interference with learning. And then we've got the academic definition, which is intentional and repeated hurtful act with an imbalance of power. And then we've got the definition for a civil rights hostile environment, which is serious, persistent, or pervasive hurtful acts against a protected class student that has caused interference with learning and participation. And if you note the difference between statutory and civil rights, usually statutory focuses on an act, whereas civil rights is serious, persistent, or pervasive, and I'm going to talk more about that because that's critical. And then we've got what people think, and this includes students and parents, then that somebody was hurtful to me, or someone was hurtful to my child. There are, in fact, many forms of hurtful behavior, and they could go by all of these words: bullying, cyberbullying, conflict, drama, discriminatory harassment, retaliation, physical harm or threat, disrespect, bias incident, sexual harassment, relational aggression, hazing, dating abuse, mobbing, and self-bullying. So the bottom line is, all students need to gain the skills necessary to avoid and resolve all forms of hurtful behavior, and schools must effectively intervene if hurtful behavior is causing distress or disruption. That is, if the student has been unable to get this to stop. It's also important to recognize that there are issues arising in adolescence. We know that their bullying prevention programs have zero effectiveness at the secondary level. And also that the rate at which young people do not ask for help just goes up very high as puberty comes in. So what is puberty bringing? Puberty is bringing a desire for independence and personal control. Students are developing their own personal identity. And hurtful behavior is simply less obvious, and there is reduced adult supervision. Really importantly, young people who are teenagers want to resolve their relationship challenges independently. The greatest risks of brain development during the teen years are acting without thinking, failing to predict the consequences of their actions, playing follow the leader, especially if that leader is being hurtful, and valuing themselves based on the level of attention they are getting from others. As already is probably become obvious, I have some significant concerns with the information that's being provided on the stopbullying.gov website. This is their description of children at risk of being bullied. They're perceived as being different, such as overweight, underweight, wearing glasses. They're perceived as being weak, depressed, anxious, have low self-esteem, are less popular, don't get along well with others. So educators are being told that those who are bullied are essentially different, weak, and unpopular. But note how they didn't list the fact that these are often students who are being discriminated against with bias and hurtful acts based on disabilities, neurodiversity, LGBTQ plus status, race, national origin, color, and religion. This was omitted from this list of children who are at risk of being bullied, and this is the list of the students who are most frequently bullied. I think it's important to reflect on the images that we present. These are stock images out there on young people who are being bullied. What words come to mind? Weak, wimp, worthless? How do these images make students who are treated badly feel about themselves? Loser? Then we get the common description of those who engage in bullying. We are told that they exhibit delinquent behaviors, dislike school, drop out of school, drink alcohol and smoke, hold beliefs supportive of violence, bring weapons to school, and think of suicide and attempt suicide. We educators are essentially told that those who bully others are at-risk, dangerous youth. Now, the good thing that came out of this National Research Council report, Preventing Bullying Through Science, Policy, and Practice, is this statement. There is a stereotype held by the general public about individuals who bully. Now, the source of this stereotype is the federal government, stopbullying.gov. But anyway, the stereotype is that they are high on psychopathology, have low social skills, have few assets and competencies that the peer group values. The stereotype is that those who bully others are at-risk students. The reality is that most of those who bully are not at risk. Most children and youth who bully others wield considerable power within their peer networks. These high-status perpetrators tend to be perceived by peers as being popular, socially skilled, and leaders. High-status bullies, don't call them bullies, please, have also been found to rank high on assets and competencies that the peer group and staff value as being attractive, good athletes. They have not been found to rank low on psychopathology. So let's shift our thinking. The primary source of bullying behavior, hurtful behavior in your school, are students who are being hurtful to achieve social dominance. These are the words that would apply to these students. Popular, competent, socially skilled, leaders, attractive, cool, good athletes, have empathy, and they are compliant to school staff. They are not at-risk youth. As Dr. Jovanin and Drs. DC and Ryan, again, citations are in my book, have discussed, this is ethological-based behavior. And there are two kinds of targets. The targets are those students who are perceived to be deviant, who may or may not be at risk, but are perceived different, as well as rivals or perceived rivals who are generally not at-risk students. So this is where you get the conflict and the drama activities, hurtful activities among students who are jockeying for higher positions on the social ladder in the school. Since this is social dominance behavior by students who are generally not at risk, risk prevention approaches are not going to reduce this kind of hurtful behavior. A very dangerous situation that is unfortunately quite frequently present in schools is that the socially skilled, compliant leadership student is slyly and persistently hurtful to a lower status student. This lower status student may bravely report, but the principal doesn't think the compliant popular student is likely to have been that hurtful. And the principal may rationalize, well, it was just a joke. You're overreacting. If you would just stop whatever behavior, this wouldn't happen. And then also frequently what happens is that the targeted student may trigger or retaliate. And usually when this happens, this is a more visible outburst, which results in the targeted student being suspended. So the outcome of this is that the targeted student learns to distrust and isn't going to report again because nothing positive is going to happen if they do. The hurtful student learns that nothing bad will happen to them if they continue this hurtful behavior. There's an increased risk of disruption and the potential for youth suicide or school violence, and this is likely a significant factor in the reported lack of effectiveness of staff in responding to bullying. Actually, I have donkeys and goats, and livestock people know that if you put a bunch of animals who haven't been together before in a pasture, there will be bullying until the animals establish their social structure. Well, this is exactly what happens when students enter a new school, such as when they shift to middle school or high school. There is hurtful behavior that is directly tied to efforts to establish where they are on the school's social ladder. And next year, my concern is that because of the disruption related to the pandemic, this is going to increase. We will have both 6th and 7th graders and 9th and 10th graders who are being hurtful to each other to establish their dominance and their place on the school's social ladder. There is really helpful insight from the business leadership field, and they talk about two kinds of business leaders: dominance leaders, who increase their social status through intimidation, manipulation, and control, and prestige leaders, who focus on the success of their group and demonstrate the knowledge and skills their group needs to succeed. Now, I don't like the term prestige, but that's what the business literature uses. These leaders focus on teamwork. And what this indicates is that when you look at your students in the schools, the ones who are at the top of the social ladder, you should be able to see two different kinds of leaders: those who got there by being hurtful and putting down others and this dominance focus, and those who are really focusing on teamwork and supporting the whole community. Identifying and empowering these prestige student leaders is going to be a secret to success in reducing bullying and encouraging young people to step in and help when they witness this kind of hurtful behavior. Another aspect of the hurtful behavior, in the survey that I conducted, I asked how frequent they were hurtful, and then evaluated that data based on whether or not they had reported that someone had been hurtful to them. And as you can see, students who were hurtful were 3.6 times more likely to also have had someone be hurtful to them. I also asked, when you were hurtful, what were you thinking? And the top two responses were, I acted too fast when angry and did not think, and this student had been hurtful to me. So impulsive retaliation also appears to be a concern. The original Adverse Childhood Experiences study focused on family-based trauma experiences of middle-class white people. The study was not ethnically diverse, and they did not address trauma at school or in the community. This has led to a focus on the family as the primary source of trauma, which has resulted in not considering other sources of trauma. Being bullied is a form of trauma. There has been reported a higher incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms among students who reported they were bullied, and a strong association between the frequency of exposure to bullying and such symptoms. Further, the experience of being bullied by peers becomes biologically embedded in the physiology, the brain of the developing child, which in turn impacts their health and behavior. There is also important evidence of the fact that trauma is being inflicted upon students while they are at school. There have been numerous studies who have found that young people are more likely to attempt or complete suicide during the school year, and this declines during the 2 weeks that they are off for Christmas vacation. So we have to understand that the school climate is traumatizing for some students. What is really of concern to me when I look at resources for trauma-informed strategies is that the term bullying is not found in these strategies, or if it's found, it is only in reference to make sure you have a policy against bullying, which is not working. So this is my opinion. I think it is entirely inappropriate to claim that your school is implementing trauma-informed practices if you are not addressing and implementing a comprehensive approach to address the bullying and harassment that is occurring while students are at school, and annually assessing your effectiveness in reducing hurtful behavior by students and staff. We need to consider the interface of bullying and trauma more effectively. Being bullied is experiencing trauma. Those who have experienced trauma may be more likely to be bullied because the trauma has interfered with their ability to form positive relations. And those who have experienced bullying or other trauma may also be more likely to engage in aggression because they're trying to gain some power in their painful environment. So with all of these aspects of hurtful behavior, how effective can schools expect an approach that's focusing on making sure school staff are trained into what bullying is, what the policies and rules are, and how to enforce the rules? Please note, this is not intended as criticism of educators. This is intended of criticism of the guidance that is being provided to educators, because I think educators are going to be able to do a whole heck of a lot better if they have more effective guidance. It's also important to address the token rewards or behavior management charts that many schools use. Research evidence documents that the use of external rewards interferes with intrinsic motivation, can model relational aggression, is likely to be implemented in a manner that is biased, and can be very discouraging for students who have greater challenges. These are some statements that were found in some literature supporting rewards that state, when students see somebody receiving a reward for demonstrating appropriate behavior, they will be more likely to engage in that same behavior to be rewarded also. Not if they can't self-regulate or if they don't have the skills. Another statement, an effective reward system provides teachers and staff the opportunity to make a positive connection with all students. Not if all students aren't receiving rewards. This is highly discouraging for students who have experienced trauma or are neurodiverse and can't maintain their behavior to consistently receive rewards. Research has also documented that rewards are ineffective in motivating performance on complex behaviors. And complex behaviors are those that are involved in maintaining positive interpersonal relationships. Also, rewards interfere with the development of intrinsic motivation, which may actually result in decreasing students' actions of being kind when an adult is not present to give a reward. Publicly denigrating, that is, publicly providing notice to all students that this child is a red card child, or excluding certain students from fun activities because they didn't get sufficient rewards, models relational aggression. This communicates to students that it's okay to denigrate and exclude certain students based on their failure to abide not maybe by the school's expectations, but by this student's expectations. Students with challenges are regularly bullied by the compliant and socially skilled students who regularly receive the rewards. There's also the potential of determining which students to reward is highly likely to be shaped by implicit bias, just as schools' disciplinary decisions are. Further, there's a mistaken belief that students misbehave because they lack the motivation to behave, and that rewards will provide such motivation. Students who have experienced trauma, are neurodiverse, or have disabilities, and they therefore lack the skills to maintain appropriate behavior. Then their inability to obtain rewards can lead to further discouragement. Next, we're going to discuss the challenges related to intervention. There is a lot of conflicting guidance that has been provided to school leaders. First, they're told to adopt policies, tell students to report, investigate, and impose punishment. That's under state statute. but under federal civil rights regulations, they are told to identify a hostile environment and take steps reasonably expected to stop the harm, remedy the harm, and correct the environment. School leaders are also told, don't use conflict resolution or mediation for bullying. And at the same time, they're being told, don't suspend students, use restorative practices, which sounds to them like conflict resolution or mediation. I have a lot of concern about the statutory approach to intervening in bullying. Districts are required by statute to adopt policies that address bullying with rules, reporting, investigation, and sanctions. This shifts the focus of the principal from how to resolve a hurtful situation to determining whether or not a student violated a rule and should be punished. These hurtful incidents are frequently persistent, hurtful, but more minor acts of harm, and they aren't the serious acts that cause a substantial disruption, which is when a principal is going to think that a student needs to be suspended. Students are rarely punished under the bullying statutes, and the target is told this is not bullying, even when this may be real persistent hurtful acts that are totally interfering with this student's feelings of safety and welcome at school and ability to learn. And we should recognize by now that sanctions are known to be ineffective in changing behavior, and what we want to do is change behavior. We know that schools have been directed to reduce suspensions and expulsions, and they must annually report on the number of bullying incidents to the state. Sanctions are a black mark on the school, so principals are less inclined to impose a sanction if this must be reported. In 2010, the U.S. Department of Education advised states to have statutes that require schools to make annual public reports of the number of bullying incidents. In states that have this public reporting requirement, the number of cases reported by schools has plummeted. I do mean plummeted. New York is a state that has a public bullying report requirement. And in the 2013-14 school year, 71% of New York City schools reported 0 incidents of harassment, bullying, and discrimination of students for the entire school year. And look at the rate at which student-reported level of bullying has been increasing in that state. This isn't working. I've seen decision grids that have been provided by states to guide principals in determining whether a reported offense is bullying. Now, you go through this decision grid, and it very often results in a determination that this was not bullying. Usually, it's determined that it's not bullying because the incident wasn't significant enough, and there's ignoring the fact that there are multiple pervasive, more minor hurtful incidents. And usually what happens is that the student who bravely reported the concern is told that this isn't bullying, so there's nothing the school can or will do. So what's happening is that the vast majority of students don't even report when they're being bullied, even when they're seriously distressed. And if they do, these frequently persistent hurtful situations have not caused a substantial disruption. So the principal considers the situation to not be bullying because there's a desire to not suspend students. And so the school decides that bullying is not a problem, even though the survey data demonstrates that it is a problem. In this push to reduce suspensions, schools have been advised to use restorative practices. And in many schools, this is implemented through mediation or restorative circles, Well, mediation and restorative circles are ineffective and dangerous when there's an imbalance of power between the students. Restorative practices have an excellent underlying theory and approach, but only if implemented comprehensively and effectively. So at this point in time, I'm going to say bullying prevention isn't rocket science. It's far more complicated, especially when the coordinates given to the rockets are in conflict and going in the wrong direction. Lastly, we're going to discuss the legal issues which actually relate to the challenges of intervention. Now, I am a strong promoter of reliance on the civil rights regulations as a far more effective approach to intervening in situations involving bullying or discriminatory harassment. These laws include Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, which address sex and gender, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which addresses race, color, national origin, and religion if grounded in national origin, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. What these regulations call for is an effective investigation. The focus is on whether a hostile environment exists. And a hostile environment is defined as when hurtful conduct is serious, persistent, or pervasive and interferes with a student's ability to learn and or participate in school activities. If a school knows or should know of these concerns, it must conduct a prompt, thorough, and unbiased investigation. Now, the focus of this investigation, as compared to the statutory focus, is that the investigation is to determine whether a hostile environment exists, not to determine whether the accused student should be suspended because they violated the rules. Also, under the civil rights regulations, there is a requirement for an effective intervention. If a hostile environment has been found to exist, schools are required to take steps that are reasonably calculated to end the harassment by the hurtful student or students and prevent retaliation. And the regulations specify that simply punishing or suspending the student isn't going to be enough to make the harassment stop. Schools are also required to remedy the harmful effects on the target, and this includes both the emotional and academic harm that has been inflicted. Lastly, and most importantly, the school is required to correct aspects of the environment that appear to be supporting the hurtful acts. And this could include how staff are treating the student, behavior management approaches, cultural competencies, implicit bias, and athletic department activities, whether or not you've got a toxic masculinity environment within your athletic program. This is from an Office for Civil Rights Dear Colleague letter. When the behavior implicates civil rights, school administrators should look beyond simply disciplining perpetrators. While disciplining perpetrators is likely a necessary step, it is often insufficient. A school's responsibility is to eliminate the hostile environment created by the harassment, address its effects, and take steps to ensure that harassment does not occur. Also, under Section 504, if a student with disabilities is being bullied or engaging in bullying, the school must develop an intervention plan that addresses the identified concerns in a full IEP or 504 team meeting. And that means they must include steps reasonably calculated to end the harassment, remedy the harmful effects, and correct the hostile environment. And this plan should be set forth in the IEP or 504 plan. Now, the IEP or 504 plan may also include functional objectives for the targeted student to increase that student's interpersonal relationship skills. The requirements for this were outlined in Dear Colleague letters in 2013 and 2014. So, If a student is being treated badly on any basis, that is protected class or not, and that student has developed mental health concerns associated with this harm, which could be depression, anxiety, suicide behavior, and this is interfering with the student's ability to learn and participate, this student should be reviewed for having a mental health disability that's interfering with their learning and placed on a 504 plan. Then the bullying of the student should be addressed within the 504 plan. The sole reason for this 504 plan may be the serious, persistent, or pervasive hurtful acts the student has been experiencing and the mental health consequences thereof. There is potential liability of schools for staff-on-student harassment or student-on-student harassment. The standards that must be demonstrated are that the student is a member of or perceived to be a member of a protected class, that the school had actual knowledge, that the hurtful student or staff member was under the school's authority, that severe, pervasive, persistent behavior deprived the student of access to the educational opportunities or benefits, and that the school was deliberately indifferent to this situation. The U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights has given this definition of deliberate indifference. If a school district is aware that students are not being deterred from engaging in harassment by individual disciplinary action, and the district continues to rely on these disciplinary measures as its exclusive remedy, that response would not be considered reasonably calculated to prevent persistent harassment from occurring again. We have to look at the actions of the National School Boards Association in this arena. NSBA provides legal assistance in cases where schools have been alleged to be deliberately indifferent to a hostile environment. They have successfully argued, in too many cases, in my opinion, that if every time the student reported an incident, the principal investigated and made an intervention determination, this should be sufficient to avoid a claim that the school was deliberately indifferent. And I hate to say this, but having focused on these issues for well over a decade, it is my opinion that NSBA and its partners, state associations, are a primary reason why school districts are ignoring the requirements of the civil rights laws that hold a much greater promise for a positive resolution of these hurtful, hostile environment situations. A limitation of the civil rights laws are that they are only available to protected class students, and sometimes students who are not within the protected class are the ones who are targeted. Now, if it may be found that the hurtful acts have led to the targeted students experiencing mental health disability that's interfering with their learning, they are now considered a protected class student. It is my opinion that every student who is experiencing a serious, persistent, or perversive hurtful situation deserves a complete investigation of the situation and steps taken to stop the harassment, remedy the harm, and correct the hostile environment. This is the slide that I created before the Supreme Court decision, where I state schools have the authority to respond to off-campus student speech if that speech has or foreseeably could cause a substantial disruption in school or a significant interference with the ability of a student or students to receive an education. I noted there was a Supreme Court case pending on this, but I am sure that this is how they would decide the case. So the update is, this is how they decided the case. And they specifically noted that schools have the ability to intervene when the situation involves bullying or harassment. It's really important that schools have a notice in their policy that they will respond to this off-campus speech. And it's exceptionally important that the school realize that substantial disruption means disruption of the delivery of educational opportunities to a student, not a disruption in the life of a staff member. If a student has targeted a staff member online and there has been no disruption of student learning, suspending that student could lead to liability. And in those kinds of situations, it's important to assess whether the staff member has been hurtful to the student. This language is going to sound familiar. Schools have the authority to restrict hate speech on campus if that speech has or foreseeably could cause a substantial disruption in school or a significant interference with the ability of a student or students to receive an education. The primary issue in the hate speech cases is in situations where there has been no obvious substantial disruption or interference. So it's really important that schools be diligent in documenting prior situations that have caused harm and document research insight into the foreseeable harm. And this is far easier to do when there's been a substantial disruption. Must be far more attention paid to whether or not there's been a significant interference with the ability of a student to receive an education. So in free speech cases, either off campus or hate speech on campus, the focus always has to be on documenting either the substantial disruption to student learning in the school community or a significant interference with any individual student's ability to learn and participate in school activities. That's where the focus has to be. Thank you very much for your attention. As indicated, this is video 1. There are 2 more videos in this series. At the end of the series, you may receive a certificate that you have watched all 3 of the videos. I am providing these videos at no charge. I am requesting a gratuity donation if you watch and use the certificate. Thank you very much.